والصلاة والسلام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين. وفقنا الله وإياكم بعلم وعمل صالح إن شاء الله، بذكر الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. أما بعد، فقد قال الله الحكيم في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بيوت أذن الله أن ترفع ويذكر فيها اسمه يسبح له فيها بالغدو والآصال رجال لا تلهيهم تجارة ولا بيع عن ذكر الله وإقام الصلاة وإيتاء الزكاة. آمنا بالله. صدق الله العلي العظيم. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's an honor and a privilege to be with you in the wafat commemoration of Imam Baqir alayhi salatu wassalam. When we speak about the life of the Holy Prophet, when the Holy Prophet meets Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari, he says to Jabir, Ya Jabir, you will meet from my lineage my grandson. He will go by my name and he will be titled, or he will be given the title of Al-Baqir. Al-Baqir meaning Baqara ilman Baqara. Baqara ilman Baqara. Meaning that you will come across a son of mine from my lineage who will have the capacity, who will have the ability to split open knowledge. And it's very interestingly, if you approach it from the perspective that the Holy Prophet, the fact that he was able to prophesize the coming of Imam Baqir alayhi salam, which itself is a miracle. It is a miracle in his own right to be able to identify that the fifth from his lineage will be the one who will represent and will guard his message the way it ought to be guarded. And it's very interesting when you look at the life of Imam Baqir alayhi salam. There were certain troubles and there were certain challenges that he faced. But like any other Imam, when they see a challenge, they have the ability to identify solutions to those challenges. So in the discussion that we have together, inshallah, there are two specific challenges that were sought or that were identified by the Imam alayhi salam. Number one was the moral decay that was now rampant within the community, within the Muslim Ummah. There was a reason behind that. We'll speak about that reason. And number two, the intellectual decline that existed amongst the Muslim Ummah. With regards to the first, with regards to the moral decadence, the moral decay that was now embodied in the hearts of the people. You know, when you study political philosophy, there's an idea that has been presented by many philosophers throughout the different centuries. Muslim philosophers as well as non-Muslim philosophers. They say that a leader of an empire, a leader of a civilization, the way they conduct themselves, the values that they have, naturally the people will embody the same values. That's why Islam emphasizes the idea that when a leader comes into power, by necessity, according to our madhab, it has to be a ma'soom. Because you can identify that a ma'soom will have the best of values and that will trickle down to the rest of society. If you have, for example, a leader or a leadership or a government that is corrupt in its essence, naturally the people will adopt the same levels of corruption and they will embody it within their lives. Ibn Khaldun, a famous Sunni historian, very famous Sunni historian, has written a compendium speaking, identifying historically the rise and the falls of empires, why certain empires came into power and what factors led to their decline. In the end, he comes to a conclusion. He says that governments prevent injustice other than such that it commits itself. That initially when a government comes into power, their primary responsibility is to try and diminish the injustice that takes place. But eventually, somewhere along the line, they end up becoming culprits of injustice as well. They say that when a community, in a society, when there is cohesion amongst the people, the government becomes relaxed. There is lax from the government's perspective. When this lax comes into place, when the government begins to relax, it begins to exploit its citizens. And it does so for its own advantage. When there is the exploitation of the citizens, that's injustice. And when it happens for a long period of time, when it's apparent and it's manifest, the people sooner or later will rise up against the government. And another party will come in and the whole cycle will start all over again. And that's natural. When a human being is given power that he has never tasted before, it begins to corrupt the individual. That's why we say by necessity the human being or the person who is in power has to be a ma'soom. That's why when Nabi Sulaiman alayhi salam in the Quran, he turns to Allah, he says, Ya Allah, give me a kingdom that no other person has had before me and no other shall have after me. What was the reason behind that? It was him to declare to his people or to the people in history that despite the power that was held in the hands of Sulaiman alayhi salam, he was able to govern with justice. That if any other person was to have a fraction of what Sulaiman had, they would naturally move towards corruption. It was to show that only an Imam al-Ma'sum has the responsibility and has the power to bring about justice within the lands. Hisham ibn Abdul Malik, during the time of Imam Baqir alayhi salam, if you look at history, if you look at the way he observed himself, the way he held certain values, you can identify the level of corruption that existed within his government. They say, for example, he began to wear certain clothes that were very, very lavish. We're talking about, Imam Baqir alayhi salam is not too far from Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. We know the history of Amir al-Mu'mineen. We know the history of the Khulafa, how they used to dress. It wasn't as luxurious as how the Bani Umayyah had instilled it. When he became and presented himself in public, he would wear the most lavish of clothes. Not only himself, he made sure that his entourage, his maids, his servants wore lavish clothes as well. He surrounded himself, immersed himself within luxuries. Beyond that, entertainment. There was a massive movement towards entertainment and funding entertainment, meaning plays were conducted, poems or poets were now being paid lavishly to come and perform in front of the Caliph, to come and perform in public. They would speak about battles, they would speak about their lineage, their forefathers, they would praise their forefathers as this was the custom of the people of Jahiliyyah. Very interestingly, the Prophet came to remove Jahiliyyah, but then eventually it came back and it immersed within the people. When this happened, number one, luxury. Number two, entertainment. Naturally, the people were affected by this. Historians go on to say that because of his cold-heartedness, his uncaring nature for his own people, naturally this disseminated and this permeated amongst the hearts of the people themselves. They too became uncaring. That love for brotherhood, that essence of looking after one another no longer existed within the society. People were now living as individuals rather than as part of a society. Individualism is a toxic, it's a poison that has embedded within our society, but it also existed during the time of Imam Baqir alayhi salam. Doing good, being kind, altruistic qualities, none of this was present amongst the people of the time. You see, when you now talk about how people used to live their lives, and then you talk about how the Imams would give charity in abundance, contextually it all makes sense. If people naturally never had the essence to help others, who never cared for others, never did good for others, but then when they would come towards the sons of Rasulullah, the sons of Rasulullah would give everything they would have, as much as they could, to those who are in need. Contextually, it gives you a beauty of how the Imams alayhim salam used to live their lives. They identified a problem and they would come and provide solutions to themselves and of course to the people, the closest of companions, and to the people of Medina, to the extent that when they were martyred, the people of Medina themselves would cry and weep because they lost that essence, the heart of the community. Very interestingly, Imam Baqir alayhi salam, after observing how Hisham ibn Abdul Malik used to live his life in such luxury and the priorities that he gave to certain celebrities, he turned to Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam and he would say, my grandfather, the Imam, Amir al-Mu'mineen, he would wear clothes. You would never think that he is the governor or he is the caliph. He would wear clothes in such a way that when the poor would look towards him, they would use him as an example. The clothes used to be worse than the beggars in the streets. They would never complain for what they have after they saw Amir al-Mu'mineen. And when the rich saw him, the rich would learn from him, from the clothes that he would wear. He had all the power, more than a rich person had, more than a person who with affluence had in their hands. And yet he was living his life in such a state. So both parties, from both extremes, would learn from Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. The second issue that was prevalent within the society was an intellectual problem. The approach to religion and religious affairs. And this began in the time of the second caliph specifically. You see, in the time of the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab did something which was very, very controversial, extremely controversial, which was the banning of ahadith, where he publicly came forward and he forbade companions of the Holy Prophet to narrate the ahadith of the Holy Prophet. Now, why did he do that? That's a separate discussion altogether. Much more in-depth discussions are reserved for this particular question as to why he banned the ahadith. But he banned the ahadith. In fact, one of the excuses that he said, or he proclaimed publicly, was, I fear that the people will focus more on ahadith and abandon the Holy Quran. And our scholars, our historians, for many, many centuries, when they examined this particular statement or reason, they say this was a baseless statement. There was no justification behind this. When you look at the ahadith of the Holy Prophet of Islam, in comparison to the Quran, they're different in nature. The profundity of the Quran is very, very different. When you compare Nahjul Balagha, the peak of eloquence, the greatest expression of balagha, of rhetoric, from Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, the greatest mind that lived after Rasulullah, even his words are not comparison to the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Umar ibn al-Khattab's fear that the people would abandon the Quran, not necessarily. The Quran is the word of Allah. وَإِنَّ لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. Allah says that I will protect the Quran. His second baseless assumption was that the people would mix up the ahadith with the Holy Quran. Again, the quality of Allah's words are very, very different compared to the qualities of the words. Even the words of the Imam alayhi salam. A person who knows Arabic would understand that there is a vast difference between a hadith from the ma'asum and of course the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The mixture of the two will never take place. وَإِنَّ لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ, as Allah emphasizes in the Holy Quran. It is He who has taken on the responsibility to preserve the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, the narrations mention that a man by the name of Qazrat ibn Ka'ab, he once came towards Medina, he sat with the second caliph, and then as he was about to leave and to go back to Kufa, Umar ibn al-Khattab escorted him towards the boundaries of Medina. So when they reached the boundaries of Medina, as they were about to part ways, Umar said to him, he said, do you know why I have accompanied you to see you out of Medina? Qazrat replies, he says, I thought it's because of the respect that you have for us. He said, yes, there is respect for you. But there is a very important matter that I wish to raise with you. I hear that the people of Kufa, when they gather in the masajid, they emphasize and they focus on the Quran. Make sure that it stays that way. Make sure that the people do not busy themselves with the narrations of the Prophet of Islam. Because I fear that they will abandon the Quran and they will focus more on the narrations of the Holy Prophet. So you can find these narrations are vast in number, that he emphasized this and he made it law. Anyone who wrote the traditions of the Holy Prophet of Islam, they were punished in one way or another. The effect of which can be seen years later, decades later, primarily during the time of Imam Baqir alayhi salam. What happened? Imagine, when you have the sunnah of Rasulullah, the sunnah of the Holy Prophet is his words, is his actions. How do you preserve that? You preserve that by recording whatever the Prophet did. If you want to know how to live an iconic lifestyle, we turn to the Holy Prophet of Islam. But what happens when you have a community of individuals who have not recorded what the Prophet did or what the Prophet said? Essentially, what happens later on in history, people forget. Now remember, we're talking about a time where paper, pen, these were very difficult to get access to. There was no paper production the way we see paper production. So, information was orally transmitted. In fact, Western academia says that the essence of the Muslim community at the time was that they would transmit the Quran, they would transmit narrations of the Holy Prophet orally, as if it was an advantage that happened in that specific time. But if you look at it from a second perspective, a different perspective, Umar ibn al-Khattab banned the writing of a hadith. So they had to refer to oral transmission of narrations. But what happened was essentially along the line, people began to fabricate narrations. And this is very clear in history as well. At the time of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan and his successors, they began to fabricate narrations left, right, and center. It became a business proposal for those who are interested in this particular area. The likes of Abu Huraira, for example, the likes of Ka'b al-Ahbar, and the likes of other individuals, they began to narrate narrations that were never spoken of or attributed to the Holy Prophet of Islam. You know, very interestingly, Eid al-Ghadir is coming up, yes? At the time of Ghadir, at the time of Hujjat al-Wada, when the Prophet is delivering his sermon of Ghadir, part of the sermon he mentions this issue. He says, after me, people will come and ascribe lies towards me. There will be many that will come towards the fold of Islam, and with it they will fabricate narrations attributing it to me. It says, for such individuals, let them prepare themselves for the fires of hell. So the proliferation of fabrications of ahadith was very well established within the Muslim Ummah. There's one particular narration. Imam al-Rida alayhi salatu wassalam. He mentions this. He says that many lies and fabrications entered the religion of Islam, specifically with regards to us, the Ahl al-Bayt. So many traditions, fabricated traditions, were attributed towards the characteristics of the Ahl al-Bayt. He said there were three in nature. The first were of the ghulat, those who came and exaggerated our position to the level of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Those of the muqassirin, those who have belittled our position. These are two extremes. Those who enhance the position of the Ahl al-Bayt and those who deplete the position of the Ahl al-Bayt. So in essence, you can think of it this way: those who enhance the Ahl al-Bayt up to the station of Allah, and those who degrade the position of the Ahl al-Bayt to the level of normal human beings. It says, and then the third category were those who began to mention the merits of our enemies. By mentioning the merits of the enemies of the Ahl al-Bayt as well as the Holy Prophet of Islam, all of a sudden you've opened up gates whereby you give them authority, where they become an authority in the explanation of Islam. That's a very important point to mention. Instead of referring to those who have knowledge, you're referring to enemies of Rasulullah who in their final days became Muslim, just as about the Prophet was leaving this world, they chose to become Muslims, and now all of a sudden they had become authorities in the religion of Islam. So you learn salah from them, you learn how to perform wudu, you learn how to perform hajj, all from these different types of individuals. From a historical perspective, likewise, these narrations that were being fabricated, they had nothing to do with, in the minority, but for the major part, they had nothing to do with akhlaq. They had nothing to do with fiqh, but they had to do with mentioning the merits of certain individuals. You see, when you take a person like Ali alayhi salam, and you see Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, and you identify the levels of merits that he has that have been repeated by the Holy Prophet of Islam, it's very difficult to undo all of that. It's very difficult to now remove those merits that belong to Ali alayhi salam. But if you're determined to bring down the position of Ali alayhi salam, what other avenue do you have? And there is only one other avenue you have. Instead of bringing his position down, you raise the position of others. You make it seem as if they were equals in contemporaneous to Ali alayhi salam. And that's exactly what happened in history. Beyond that, in the time of Imam Baqir alayhi salam, there was another issue. The issue was because there was the banning of ahadith, no one knew exactly what the sunnah of the Holy Prophet was. No one knew how the Prophet prayed, because no one bothered to write down and transmit how exactly the Prophet prayed. How did the Prophet perform wudu? Today we have different schools of thought. And there are 4 different ways in which a person, or 5 different ways in which a person performs wudu. But they're all correct, supposedly. There are 5 different ways in which a person performs salah. There are 5 different ways in which a person performs, for example, siyam and the different aspects of fasting. all of this stems from the idea that the banning of ahadith was something that was very much established within the Muslim Ummah. And so by necessity, when you had scholars coming out, they used to refer to their own opinions in trying to understand what Islam was, what the Sunnah of Rasulullah was. When you look at the likes of Abu Hanifa studied under Imam Baqir alayhi salam as well, as much as Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. Abu Hanifa, he knew the proliferance of Imam Baqir alayhi salam. But yet when he comes forward and he says, for me to understand what the Sunnah of Rasulullah was, I use my own judgment, I use qiyas, I use, for example, rationality to understand certain laws. Why did this happen? Why was he pushed to such a stage? Because there were lack of resources, authentic resources that he could refer to understand what exactly the Sunnah of Rasulullah was. And of course, the famous debate that takes place between him and Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, Imam Sadiq exposes him that there is no rationality in Islam. The reason why you have to observe rationality is because you don't have a true pathway that links you all the way to the Holy Prophet of Islam. Very interesting dimension of this discussion. And so you found that naturally Imam Baqir alayhi salam saw all of the different problems and challenges in his time from an intellectual capacity, and he began to identify it and he began to find solutions to it. On the one hand, what were the solutions provided by the Imam alayhi salam? On the one hand, it was his akhlaq. If it wasn't his akhlaq, it was his teaching of how to spiritually uplift oneself, how to nurture akhlaq within one's life. Every prophet, likewise every imam, has the power to perform miracles. The ayah of the Holy Quran mentions this with regards to prophets. Ayat wal bayyinat. Both were ammunition given to the prophets to show their people that this is the reason as to why we claim ourselves to be linked with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Likewise, the Imams, just as how the prophets had the power of miracles, the Imams too had the powers of miracle. This is not something that is impossible. Once a person is identified to be a guardian of the message of Islam, this is an ability that's given to them by Allah. By necessity, when the occasion occurs, they have to perform these miracles or such miracles. There are certain cases in narrations where I have observed that the Imams would not necessarily perform miracles to prove that they're right in the message, but to nurture their companions' spirituality, to kind of to console them and to show them that there is always a difficult path when one leads their life, but by observing the difficult path, there is great rewards that is associated with it. Jabir al-Ju'fi is one of them. They say Jabir al-Ju'fi, he was having a very, very bad day. One day he came towards Imam Baqir alayhi salam and he pours his heart out. He says, I've been wronged and I need some money. I don't have any wealth. I need some money. The Imam says to him, very interestingly, the Imam says to him, I do not have a single dirham to give you. So he stays with Imam Baqir for a while. They say after a while, a man by the name of Kumayt came towards Imam Baqir alayhi salam. When you read the history of Kumayt, remarkable personality. He was like Farazdak, contemporaneous to Farazdak. He was a poet and he was at the service of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. He came towards Imam Baqir alayhi salam very proud. He said, I've just composed a few lines of poetry. Can you give me permission so I can read it for you? The Imam gives them permission, so Kumayt begins reciting his lines of poetry. The Imam was so moved by his lines of poetry, by his qasida, he was so moved, he turns to his servant, he says, go inside the house, go to this room and give him a badra. Now a badra in Arabic, in that time, was equivalent to 10,000 dinars. Jabir al-Ju'fi is observing all of this. So the servant goes into the house, he takes a badra, a bag full of coins, and he brings it out and he gives it, he places it in front of Kumayt. Kumayt looks at the bag of coins. He looks at Imam Baqir, he says, Ya ibn Rasulullah, I have a second line, I have a second couplet of poetry. I would love to read it for you. Imam says, proceed. He reads it. Again, the Imam is so moved, he tells the servant, bring a second bag. Give him a badra, a second badra. He sees the second bag. He says, Ya ibn Rasulullah, I have a third couplet for you. He says, proceed. Again, he's so moved, bring the third badra. So there are 3 bags of money sitting in front of him. When Kumayt finishes, he says, Yabna Rasulullah, I have composed these lines of poetry not because of the world, but because of your love. My intention is to create a silla, is to create an association, an affinity with Rasulullah through you. I don't care about this money. So the Imam alayhi salam tells his servant, he says, take this money and put it back in the room. Kumayt leaves. Jabir al-Ju'fi now is confused. Just a moment ago you told me you don't have a single dirham, but now you're willing to give 30,000 to Kumayt? So he approaches the Imam alayhi salam and he says, Yabna Rasulullah, you told me you don't have a single dirham for me, but you're very much willing to give 30,000 to Kumayt for lines of poetry. So the Imam alayhi salam said to him, he said, Jabir, the room where the money is, go into that room and see for yourself. So as Jabir enters the room, he's so confused. He turns around, he comes out, he comes to the Imam alayhi salam and he says, there's nothing in that room. The room is empty. So the Imam says to him, he says, Ya Jabir, what has been concealed from you, what we are able to provide for you is more than what we are able to reveal. We are able to reveal to you much more than what we have left a secret from you. Very interesting words that the Imam says. That the teachings that we have for you is much more valuable and enormous in terms of the materialistic world that we are able to give you. Very spiritual words from a spiritual dimension. Then he tells Jabir, he says, Jabir, come with me. They both enter the room. The Imam strikes his hand on the ground, and the narrations mention that a mountain or a small bump of red gold emerged from the ground, to the extent that it was the size of the hump of the camel. Now, when you read such a tradition, such a narration, of course, this is a miracle that was there in the hands of the Imam alayhi salam. But the message that he was giving to Jabir was, listen, don't be consumed by the world. You're going through a tough patch in life. Have and resort to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Remember, Jabir was one of the greatest companions of Imam Baqir alayhi salam, a scholar in his own right. He says, try and live your life in such difficulty because after it there is ease. When you find a solution, try and observe the harder path in life. That's a very valuable lesson that the Imam alayhi salam provides. And then of course, Jabir leaves. He understands the profundity behind the message of the Imam and then he leaves. Again, Abu Baqir was a second very proficient character and companion of the Imam alayhi salam, a scholar again in his own right. Historically, they say Abu Baqir was someone who didn't have a good sight. He was semi-blind or he was almost blind. And he came towards the Imam alayhi salam. He said, Yabna Rasulullah, I have a question for you. He says, a part of our aqidah is that you are warithatul anbiya. Is that you are someone who has inherited from the anbiya. You've inherited their knowledge. All of the teachings of the prophets, you've inherited it. Is this true? Imam says, yes. It says, likewise, can you perform the miracles the way the prophets were able to perform miracles? Can you raise the dead and cure the blind and cure the leper? So the Imam alayhi salam approaches Abu Baqir and he places his hands over his eyes. And when he removes his hands, they say Abu Baqir could see. The Imam said to him, he said, Abu Baqir, I'm giving you two options. You can, for the rest of your life, live with this ability to see. And there is nothing against you. You have the freedom to do so, to live and to see. But on the day of judgment, some of the rewards that are reserved for you, they will be lessened. Or I can take your sight away and you will have access to the rewards that Allah has reserved for you. He ponders, he thinks, he says, I would rather be in the state of blindness and to miss out on the rewards that Allah has given me. So you see, when you come across these narrations where the Imam alayhi salam actively performs miracles, it's not necessarily to prove to the audience that his message is true, but it's to nurture akhlaq within them, to allow them to facilitate a higher level of spirituality. And that was remarkable. Then you have the public debates of Imam Baqir alayhi salam. You see, when we speak about the Imams, there is always a section that is reserved when we speak about their public debates. The public debates were important in their lives because, number one, it highlighted publicly that their knowledge was unequal to the people of their time. And this has a ramification of how we approach Islam. If we understand that the Imams, their knowledge was of a different level, it means that our levels of our understanding of spirituality comes from them. Our fiqh should come from them because they are the highest in terms of knowledge. When it comes to how we should live our lives, the philosophy that we should observe when living our lives, it should come from them. That's why Imam Baqir famously in some sentences he says that you look towards the east and the west and you will never find true knowledge except that which has come from the Ahlul Bayt. You can have all of the different philosophies that will present values to you as if they are gold being presented towards you. If it does not correspond to the message of the Ahlul Bayt, it means nothing. The public debates, for example, there was one with the Christian in the courthouse of Hisham ibn Abdul Malik. And this was his downfall. This was the reason why he poisoned Imam Baqir alayhi salam. They say as the Imam was leaving towards Medina, he was forced to go towards Sham. When he finished his business with Hisham had no issues with Imam Baqir at the time. He had no more affairs, so he let the Imam go back to Medina. As he was about to leave Medina, he saw in the far end of the courthouse, people, Christians had gathered in numbers. Hundreds of Christians had gathered. So he asked, he said, what have they gathered for? He said, the Archbishop is now on his way. Usually every year the Archbishop comes to this area of the city. They gather around him and they ask questions. All of the questions that have been proposed or that they've been given by the people, the answers they don't have, they would ask the Archbishop. He's a very wise man, very intellectual, very knowledgeable. He would provide them with all the answers they need, and then that would conclude the meeting. So Imam Baqir alayhi salam enters the congregation. The Archbishop comes, he sits, they all gather around him. The Archbishop, he looks towards the crowd, but then he looks towards the face of Imam Baqir alayhi salam. He says, you're not a normal individual. Tell me, are you from amongst us or are you from the Muslims? So the Imam replies, he says, I'm from amongst the Muslims. He says, are you from the ulama or the juhala? Are you from the scholars or the ignorant? So the Imam replies, he says, I'm not from the ignorant. He says, I have a few questions for you. I've asked so many different scholars within the Muslim lands. None have been able to answer me. He says, ask as you wish. He says, within our scripture or within the world, there is a phenomena which you ascribe towards the people of heaven. Sorry, it's the other way around. He says, within heaven, there are certain phenomena that will take place which you ascribe to the world. The Imam replies, he says, like what? He says, you claim that the people of heaven will eat and eat and eat, but they will not be in need to go towards the restrooms. So how can a person consume without releasing the waste? Can we see an example of this in the world? The Imam says, of course. The fetus in the womb of the mother consumes, but it never releases waste. When he heard this answer, the Christian Archbishop said to him, he said, I thought you said you're not from the ulama. The Imam replies, he says, that's not what I said. I said I was not from the ignorant ones. So he said, there's a second question for you. He says, you claim that in heaven, the bounties and the fruits and the food are given in plenty. Well, if they are given in plenty, you also claim that they will never deplenish, it will never decline. Usually when you give something physical away, you lose some of it when you give it away. It's a natural consequence. But you claim that in heaven, it's given, but it will never deplenish, it will never lessen. How is that possible? Is there a phenomena like this that we can observe in the world? The Imam says, of course. You take a single candle, and the flame from that candle, you can light 1,000 candles. It will still not deplenish the flame of the first candle. In the same way, Allah will give merits and bounties to the people of heaven. And the debate goes on and on and on. To the extent the Archbishop is now fed up talking to the Imam alayhi salam, he turns to his congregation and he said, all of you have invited him to put me down. So he gets up and he leaves. He says, I will not see you until the following year. And he leaves. Publicly, this demonstrated the miraculous intellectual nature of Imam Baqir alayhi salam. All of it was now, all people began turning towards Hisham. And they began questioning Hisham. Hisham ibn Abdul Malik, now the threat was very much vigilant. It was very much apparent. If this is a man of knowledge, of piety, of ibadah, this is a man of akhlaq and spirituality, if this is a man who has all of these qualities, he's much more deserving of the caliphate than I am. And the only solution, unfortunately, he came across was to now assassinate the Imam alayhi salam. When he poisons the Imam alayhi salam. When he poisons the Imam alayhi salam, they say the Imam was now in a state of pain. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam was there alongside him. Imam Sadiq narrates that in the final moments of my father's life, he lay there on his bed and he began engaging in munajat. He said in this specific moment, he finished his munajat and he called towards me, my son, come towards me. When I entered the room, I sat alongside my father. He said to me, my son, this is the night in which I will return to Allah. The Imam alayhi salam passes away, but Imam Sadiq alayhi salam now takes on the rights of his father. He provides the ghusl, he shrouds the body, and he then buries the body. But we say to Imam Baqir alayhi salam, Yabna Rasulullah, at least your son was there alongside you, who fulfilled your rights after you left this world. What of your grandfather Abi Abdullah alayhi salam? Not only did they abandon his body in Karbala, but they severed his head and they began moving it from one city towards another. Imam as-Sajjad alayhi salam, they say as he enters the city of Medina, after the trials and tribulations of Kufa and Sham, they now return towards Medina. Just outside of Medina, he meets a poet. He approaches the poet and he tells him, he says that I have heard that you, just like your father, you recite qasida. He confirms this. He says, this is a skill that I have ascribed for my father. He says, go towards the people of Medina and tell them what has happened in Karbala. The Imam narrates to him what happened in Karbala. He came running back towards Medina. He came towards Masjid al-Nabi and he began crying out, Ya ahlal Yathrib la maqama lakum biha. قتل الحسين وعدمعي مدرار الجسم منه بكربلاء مذرج والرأس منه على القناة يدار. O people of Medina, you have lost all dignity. Hussein has been killed and my eyes shed tears. His body abandoned in the sands of Karbala, drowning in his own blood, and his head mounted on a lance, paraded from one city towards another. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. سيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. مات من حسين.